in this really complex coordinated social action by laying out patterns. She's laying me down. I think you're okay. Yep. What do I want to say? Creating patterns of thinking and feeling and doing at the social level that we then internalize and habituate. So they're designed to coordinate us and to continue to coordinate us so that we can keep doing complicated social things really without having to do much thinking about it. I want to make a distinction here between material social practices and epistemic social practices. So what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about material, I don't even know if material is the right word here, but I'm thinking about the ways that we collectively shape the material character of our social world. So this is a coordination of material agency on the part of individuals. And I take it that epistemic structures are primarily around coordinating shared epistemic practices. They coordinate the ways that individuals exercise their epistemic agency in order to develop or, in some cases, actively thwart the development of systems of social knowledge. Also working in the background then is a particular way of understanding individual agents within structures. I call this structurally situated agency, and I take it that what this account primarily draws our attention to is the material and epistemic agency of individuals is always done from within a set of structural practices. And I won't explain positionality. I think all of you probably know what that is. And sort of working in the background here then is this idea that individual agents are always structurally located within a set of practices that guide them or orient them towards the reproduction of the social world as it is. That means that the background patterns of thinking, feeling, and doing are already sort of orienting us to think, feel, and do certain kinds of things. However, these practices don't exist apart from individual agency. Those practices actually require individuals to think, feel, and do the things for them to continue to exist. So in that sense, it's got this sort of dual nature where our agency is informed by, shaped by the background structural conditions, but what we actually think, feel, and do shapes those conditions as well. That's the concept of structuration. Okay. And again, the idea here is that we could differentiate material forms of individual agency, situated individual agency, from epistemic forms of individual agency. Okay, so then the idea that's sort of guiding much of my thinking about epistemic injustice is that articulating injustice in a structural sense locates injustice in these background practices, in the character of the relationships that they shape. And in this case, I'm drawing on the notion of oppression that we find in Five Faces of Oppression from Iris Marion Young, but also in the accounts of oppression that come out of really a bunch of feminist work in the 80s and 90s and since then. And I want to articulate this way in which injustice is about structural epistemic injustice is about crafting shared epistemic practices that systematically constrain some while enabling others in the exercise of their epistemic agency. So again, this has both a material and an epistemic dimension. Okay. Faces of oppression, material and epistemic. I'm going to just sort of quickly run through this. Young offers this idea that all oppressed groups basically suffer some inhibition of their ability to develop their capacities and express their needs, wants, interests. In later work in Inclusion and Democracy, she says that this is contrasted with the democratic ideal of self-development. And in this case, she's also setting apart self-development from self-determination. So self-determination is thwarted by domination. Self-determination is thwarted by domination. Self-development is thwarted by oppression. The way that I understand this is that what you essentially have is a system of relationships that place unequal constraints on the exercise of material and epistemic agency, which means that the injustice here is a relational inequality among social groups. We have a set of practices that constrain some, making the exercise of their agency more difficult while enabling others. And again, this has a material and epistemic dimension. So Young's 5 faces of oppression are exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, as well as violence. And I'm essentially going to pull out what I take to be material interpretations of each of these 5 faces in order to contrast them with what I take to be their epistemic corollaries, even though that's not exactly how Young would cash this out. That's what I've aimed to do. Okay. So the first face of epistemic oppression that I want to highlight is epistemic exploitation. For Young, in the material interpretation that I'm offering, material exploitation is a steady process of the transfer of the results of the labor of one group to the benefit of another. And Young offers a number of examples, but one of these examples is the kind of basically the emotional and sexual labor that women perform in heterosexual coupling relationships. Her claim is that women put in a certain amount of labor that they don't receive back in return. And so you have a kind of systematic process by which you transfer some people's labor toward the benefit of another. So I take it that epistemic exploitation is a similar kind of steady process of transferring some people's epistemic labor and the fruits of that epistemic labor towards the benefit of others. Here, I have a bunch of different examples that I've been toying around with, but I thought I would offer up DEI tokenism, so diversity, equity, and inclusion practices, at least in the United States, are a really big deal. And they often lead to certain kinds of tokenism, so pulling in quote unquote diverse candidates who end up doing a whole bunch of work for the university that doesn't get recognized. I think it's important to highlight that that's not just material labor that they are doing, it's also emotional labor. They are putting in, they're performing labor that is designed to try to help to understand certain kinds of experiences and to try to find ways to make people's situations on campus better. That's a kind of labor that they perform for universities that they often don't receive back any kind of meaningful, set of the fruits of that labor. The notion of epistemic exploitation is also articulated by Nora Berenstain, and I think it's helpful to draw on some of her work to further articulate this. Berenstain says, epistemic exploitation is a variety of epistemic oppression marked by unrecognized, uncompensated, emotionally taxing, coerced epistemic labor. She notes that this has sort of 3 problems. First, it's uncompensated and unrecognized, but still demanded labor. The second is this double bind of coerced labor. So you end up in a double bind where you are essentially asked to give this labor, but refusal of giving that labor has pretty significant social costs. So you're sort of forced to continue to perform the exploited labor or bear the costs of refusal. And then finally, she says that this often takes the form of a kind of default skeptical response in the people who are demanding this labor. So you end up spending this time trying to explain and trying to share the knowledge that you have, explaining your situation in the context that you're talking about. And the people who encounter this knowledge, instead of listening to you, instead of believing you, instead of taking for granted that you know what you're talking about, they will often take up a default skeptical response. They might ask what they take to be friendly questions. They might take up the position of the quote unquote devil's advocate. I think concern trolling is maybe another version of this as well. But essentially what they do is they posit themselves as your epistemic peer, even though you're better situated for knowing the conditions that you are trying to articulate. And in so doing, they're essentially utilizing a certain kind of privileged position within the epistemic practices to set themselves up as an equal. In so doing, demanding more and more of your labor, the kind of labor that you might give to an equal, but not in this case. Okay. So that's epistemic exploitation. Okay. Second phase of oppression, epistemic marginalization. So for Young, marginalization is a process in which a whole category of people is expelled from useful participation in social life and thus potentially subjected to severe material deprivation and even extermination. The main threat of marginalization then is this kind of extreme form of material deprivation. But for Young, it's not just that you get positioned to potentially have to suffer this kind of deprivation, it's that you also get pushed to the margins of society. In so doing, in order to meet your material needs, you have to access those resources and opportunities through others who aren't on the margins. So this creates for Young a form of dependency for the marginalized on people, who aren't marginalized. That dependency for Young facilitates a kind of, like forfeiture of basic rights and protections that others would enjoy, but the marginalized don't get to reliably enjoy because they're forced to be dependent on others. What else do I want to say? Oh, and then finally, this also marks out a position within society where the marginalized are sort of read within the broader division of labor as not capable of productively contributing to society. So this can also lead to a social position where even if you're sort of materially secure, you feel like you're useless and you maybe lack certain social resources for being recognized within society. Okay. So epistemic marginalization, I take it, following Young, is a social group is expelled from useful participation in the epistemic practices of shared social life. Now, lots of people have written on epistemic marginalization at this point, testimonial and hermeneutical marginalization at this point. So this, I think, is somewhat parallel to some of those discussions, but is taking up sort of centering epistemic practice in this notion of epistemic marginalization. I was trying to think of good examples that really differentiate the different phases of oppression. And for this one, I thought maybe I wasn't sure where to fit in mansplaining. And now I'm going to explain mansplaining. I don't know, should I leave? I don't know. I'm not going to explain it. That's late. But what I'm thinking here is that what mansplaining largely does is it posits that certain groups of people are the authority. They take for granted their authority. They take for granted their sometimes, immediately newly found expertise. And then they project that onto other people, right? And they force other people to, go through the process of hearing them out. I take it that is a kind of epistemic marginalization. It's taking other people's epistemic agency, it's taking their knowledge, and it's in some sense disappearing them. And then if the conversation continues on, or if you're trying to do some kind of very simple task, and the man keeps going on and on, you're sort of dependent on their going through their own particular process for moving forward in that interaction. I'm not sure that's the exact analysis that I want to give, but that's what I've been thinking. Okay, so Christy Dotson, as one of the people who's discussed this kind of epistemic marginalization in her work on conceptualizing epistemic oppression, she talks about epistemic exclusion and exclusion at 3 different levels. I'm not going to talk about her account, but what I think is really important is that at each level, what Dotson is highlighting is that these kinds of exclusions, this kind of marginalization, limits access to social epistemic resources needed to develop and exercise one's social agency in socially recognized ways. So I want to just really emphasize this idea that what marginalization does is it doesn't make you incapable of knowing, it doesn't make you incapable of sharing your knowledge, it doesn't make you incapable of participating in productive epistemic community. It's instead situating you in practices that are going to treat you as though you are incapable. And it's going to deny you the resources needed to have uptake within those practices. And I think that process creates a kind of epistemic dependency. So this kind of marginalization means that if you're going to gain uptake, if you're going to be listened to, if you're going to have any of your epistemic agency treated as valuable within the broader oppressive practices, you have to conform to those practices. That might even be conforming the kinds of claims that you want to put forward to the more established dominance epistemology. This kind of dependency then invites all kinds of invasive and exploitative demands for epistemic labor, while at the same time denying the social recognition of the value of that labor. This, I think, can lead to a certain kind of epistemic uselessness, boredom, and lack of self-respect, even if internalized. I'm thinking about being on the other end of mansplaining. It seems pretty like you're pretty useless and it's quite boring, at least within the context of that particular conversation. Okay. Epistemic powerlessness. For Young, powerlessness is a process where some come to lack authority or power. The powerless are those who lack authority or power, those over whom power is exercised without their exercising it. The powerless are situated so they must take orders and rarely have a right to give them. In the 5 phases of oppression, the sort of main example that Young offers here is a distinction between the professional and non-professional class. So insofar as the non-professional class lack this kind of authority because of the way that they're positioned within broader divisions of labor, they rarely get to exercise their material labor according to their own desires, according to their own, creative and autonomous desires, and largely have to exercise their labor according to the dictates of others. Young also highlights that this means that the powerless often lack resources and opportunities to develop their capacities for creative labor within those particular contexts. And she notes that within broader systems of social recognition, the powerless are often marked as not living a life of respectability. So epistemic powerlessness, I take, is a group being denied epistemic authority in shared social epistemic practices, providing its members few options for exercising agency within and shaping those practices. I was thinking that probably this is the way that I understand Fricker's main examples in epistemic injustice, that the problem with the sort of central form of injustice that's occurring in the Tom Robinson and Mark Sherwood cases is less about not getting, a certain level of testimonial credibility, but instead about being positioned in a form that's powerless to be able to, exercise your agency in a way that your epistemic agency in a way that actually captures what you think and feel and know. Okay, I'm going to keep moving. For Fricker, epistemic injustice is a wrongful exercise of social power that harms someone as a knower. And she draws on this particular way of understanding social power. So I'm sort of working out this idea from Fricker that powerlessness is being situated in a position of diminished and unequal epistemic authority. That means that you are denied the kinds of resources for exercising your epistemic labor that you would need to be able to creatively and perform creative and self-guided epistemic labor, at least within those oppressive contexts. This also means that you are denied avenues for epistemic autonomy and recognition. Okay, epistemic imperialism. Cultural imperialism for Young is the 4th phase. She says cultural imperialism occurs when the dominant meanings of society render the particular perspective of one's own group invisible at the same time as they stereotype one's group and mark it out as the other. Essentially what happens is certain cultural practices are taken up as a universal norm. practices that deviate from that universal norm are marked out as deviant, the practices of the other. And those practices are, treated in a subordinated fashion. They can be marked using a whole bunch of different pejoratives. And that's used as a way to constraining people's ability to exercise cultural agency. I'm going to focus just quickly on the material interpretation of culture here. So usually when we talk about culture, we talk about the symbolic realm. I think it's important to note that most of our cultural expressions take a particular kind of material form, right? Clothes, food, other kinds of traditions. So I take it that we can distinguish a kind of cultural imperialism that is particularly material, taking up certain kinds of material traditions and food and clothing and ways of speaking and so on and so forth as the dominant universal norm, and then differentiating, other people's material cultural practices as deviants. But the point for doing that is to try to highlight this way in which some cultural imperialism is epistemic. So I take it that epistemic imperialism is when members of an oppressed group are forced to take on the dominant systems of thought and conform their epistemic agency to dominant modes of epistemic interaction. The example that I want to highlight here is from my brilliant and obviously more productive than me colleague, Christine Wiesler, where she actually cites an earlier version of this paper to talk about the ways in which disabled subjectivities are treated as though they are not lives worth living, according to certain kinds of epistemic imperialist practice. In epistemic imperialism, then, there's a universalization of dominant systems of thought and ways of knowing that marks out nonconformity as deviance, or other ways of knowing and other systems of thought as deviance. This is used to then dismiss knowledge and the kinds of epistemic practices that otherly situated people perform. And we might say that it potentially forces a kind of split epistemic subjectivity. Okay. Epistemic violence. Okay. I'll give one more minute. I'm out of time. So the last phase of oppression for Young is material violence. What makes violence a form of oppression is that it's systematic. It targets certain groups of people. It's socially expected that people are at least under the threat of this particular form of violence. I want to try to mark out territory for epistemic violence that takes the seriousness of calling this violence pretty seriously. I think we've started to just throw around violence maybe a little too much. And so I want to really highlight that epistemic violence, I think, is about the threat of annihilation, the threat of annihilating someone's epistemic agency. And then I've got a couple different examples here. One is just the colonial destruction of existing knowledge systems. So settler colonialism always goes in and destroys knowledge systems. It doesn't just, not just a material genocide, it's an epistemic genocide as well. It wipes out, anyways, I'll stop there. Dotson offers this notion of testimonial smothering, in which case a particular epistemic community it can't take up somebody's testimony, and so the agent who would otherwise give that testimony smothers it, silences themselves. And then finally, I think gaslighting is an attempt to annihilate somebody's agency. At the extreme, it's to put them in a position where they can't trust their own epistemic subjectivity and thus annihilate their agency. I think what makes this oppression as opposed to domination is that a lot of the work that's being done here is just in the threat of the violence. It's not in the violence itself. The threat of the violence is going to constrain the ways that people exercise their epistemic agency, even if the actual act of violent domination is not going to happen or is improbable. The mere regularized rationally expected threat is enough to do the work. Okay, I'm out of time, but the upshot of this, Okay. Well, the upshot of this is that I think this tells us, good, thank you. This maps out a different way of responding to epistemic injustice. So I take it that epistemic injustice as an injustice ought to be remedied just by definition. It requires that the people participating in that injustice should be working to remedy it. That's what an injustice is. The way to then think about why it is that you ought to remedy the injustice, we can shift away from trying to find individual faults and blaming individuals, although individuals can also be blamed, towards thinking about shared participation in epistemic injustices. So in other work, I've talked about this in the form of structural complicity. I think there's a form of structural epistemic complicity where our epistemic agency gets involved in or entangled with practices that are epistemically unjust. And what that requires of us is not just, changing our own epistemic character, not just, disengaging or cutting off certain kinds of individual epistemic practices. It requires actively working to transform the unjust practices for which we are complicit. I take it that we can then cash that out at both an individual and a social level. So at the individual level, I think this is about working to reorient ourselves within our structural epistemic practices that we're situated within, and working at essentially socializing our epistemic agency. So here I draw on Medina's notion of equability and of chaining. This is a way of, if you like, sort of scaling up or socializing our epistemic agency. At a social level, I think what this requires is direct action. So there's some emerging work on insurrection and other ways of cashing out resistance to epistemic oppression. I've been thinking a lot about the ways that direct action sort of organizes responses to material oppression. And so I've started sort of thinking about what that would mean in the context of epistemic oppression. The goal there is not to redistribute resources. It's not to give up resources or whatever. It's however you want to cash out the distributive framework. It's instead to essentially throw your epistemic body, if you will, into the gears of regular epistemic practices, to cause tension, it's to cause crisis in those practices so that they can no longer continue, and then we can start to reform them, transform, I should say. Okay, I'm way over time. Thank you, everyone.